The short answer is any substitution of a child by an entity from the other world. But yeah, you have to address the fact that this was very much a justification for infanticide,
Yeah.
especially in amongst poor Irish farmers and whatnot. There's some changeling stories that you read from Jinn lore that literally could have come from County Limerick. The fairy folklore and the alien abduction folklore are similar, but I've reached the point now where I can pretty much guarantee that you will find some precedent for one in the other. What people don't really understand, I think, or what ufologists have trouble trying to come to grips with, if they really are of the nuts and bolts, flesh and blood ufologist variety, is that sometimes inversion equals representation, and so if a child is given to you that's an inversion of a child, it's the exchange is what matters. It's similar. I think Patrick Harper put it the best way. He said that the fairies are always going. They always have this fairy exodus that's been talked about for hundreds of years, and the aliens are always coming, but never here. Fairies going, never gone. Aliens coming, and never here. So that inversion as representation, I think, is really an important concept to wrap your mind around when you're making that comparison.
Hello and welcome to episode 36 of The Spirit Box. Today I'm thrilled to welcome back Joshua Cutchin to the show. We go through his book Thieves in the Night, which is about changelings and fairy child abductions, and it's an exceptional book. I really enjoyed it. He goes through how this is a global phenomenon far beyond what we think of as being just a Britain and Ireland and Western Europe thing, and even way beyond the Jinn correlations. So really enjoyable. We get into it. We talk UFOs and aliens and the correlation with fairies and fairy lore and the experiences and the accounts. So it's good stuff. I mean, I hogged the mic a bit, so my apologies, Joshua. But I was overexcited and I just finished reading your book, so I was tremendously excited to talk to you. If you're listening, the other bit you might be interested in is I play 2 interviews that I did during the summer with some elderly Irish people talking about experiences they had with fairies when they were kids. So after reading the book, I thought it would be great to play it for him. So we'll listen out for that towards the end of the regular show. If you listen to the Plus show, it's in just towards about 2/3 of the way through. Speaking of which, in the Plus show, we get into Santa Claus and what Santa Claus represents with the kind of Odin and wild man archetype, the fact that he works with elves. We get into Men in Black. We get into the Fardov Durka. Those of you who are patrons will obviously know that from some of my Patreon shows. So loads to enjoy, and I hope you guys enjoy it. All right, that's enough for me. Let's get into it. Joshua Cutchin, you're very welcome back to the Spirit Box. Thank you very much for agreeing to come on again.
Oh, I can't quite articulate how happy I am. I've had a lot of interviews lately, but this is one that I've definitely been looking forward to more than the others. So.
Awesome. Well, I'm delighted to hear that. And after the last time you and Tim were on, we exchanged a few emails, kind of getting into the changeling, fairy, Jinn. I mean, is rabbit hole a sufficient? I mean, it's not a rabbit hole. It's like it's a mine. It's vast chasm.
It's a burial mound, is what it is.
Well, I'm super pleased to have you back on, and just reading through Thieves in the Night. It's such a great book. I'm like, I was really blown away by how well researched it is, and just how you cross-reference the themes so well and really go global with it. I was so
just struck by the Australian, like Malay people, and all the same themes again and again and again. It's a remarkable feat of research. Really great. You
Well,
know?
thank you. That's very kind of you. I was wanting to sort of have a one-stop shop for changeling lore,
Yeah.
and as you're probably aware, there really wasn't one
Mhm.
that compiled things. I think there's an out-of-print German book, Der Wechselbalg, that there are like maybe 5 or copies or something in
Right. Right.
existence. So I was like, well, so there's no English rather
Mhm.
English language resource, and the one resource that is often cited is really not non-existent.
Right.
So I put it together, and I've always had a soft spot for whatever reason for fairy lore, and it's one of those things that I think gets grossly overlooked in people who study Forteana. But it's one of those things that really is consistent across so many cultures,
Mhm.
and it doesn't explain things like UFOs and Bigfoot and all these things, but it definitely can inform them. Because if I just shift the goals and say everything's fairies, that doesn't really do anybody any good about getting to the bottom of things. But at the same time, it at least gives you a framework for understanding, honestly, a lot of, if not, in my opinion, all of the things that we experience that are anomalous.
I mean, I don't think you're wrong. There's so many things that are covered by the broad spectrum of fairy lore. There's so many witness statements. There's such an archive of accounts and folklore. And that's an interesting thing, because I often kind of, when I have discussions with people and they go like, but there's no accounts for this that are factually correct, or and all that kind of stuff. So, well, the
Right.
idea of being scientific, or scientific interrogation of these phenomena is a relatively new concept. And it's like we're only talking about like 200 years worth of kind of investigation into things from a scientific point of view. We have literally thousands of years of accounts and folklore and oral history.
Yeah, it's partially due also to the fact of this Cartesian model that has been in its death throes, and I think we're finally starting to see it really unravel.
Yeah.
At the same time, I have to be careful in my research, because people used to bandy about the word fairy like people bandy about the word supernatural now. They said, "Oh,
Yes.
that's fairy," as if it was some sort of explanation. So that is sort of a hole in that logic. But at the same time, I can't tell you how many times I practically bite my tongue in half when people are saying, "Well, UFOs may be out there, but it's not like people are saying fairies exist." And I'm like, "Oh!" You're looking at it the wrong way. I think a lot of people are.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Totally.
yeah, again, I don't really know why I sort of filter a lot of things through that fairy lens. I don't know what about that body of uh, of folklore really resonates with me. I mean, I'm Scots
Mhm.
German. I guess maybe that might be a little bit of it,
Mhm.
but for some reason, it's always had an elegance that a lot of other models of looking at the unexplained seem to lack, I think.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, and there's so much rich veins in there to tap into that do, I mean, as you've very well covered in the book. You've touched on so many themes and taken it right up to the modern day in terms of like the UFO experience, and all the kind of um, all the stuff that goes along with that. You do a great job of tracking that back through folklore.
Yeah, I used to hedge my bets a bit and say that the the alien contact experience, because I like to separate that from UFO sightings, because they might not always be the same thing, and there are plenty
Sure.
of abductions that happen in the absence of what people would call a quote unquote structured craft.
Mhm.
I used to hedge my bets a bit and say, well, the fairy folklore and the alien abduction folklore are similar, but I've reached the point now where I can pretty much guarantee that you will find some precedent for one in the other.
Right.
Um, all the way through stuff like alien implants having an analogy in the fairy blast,
Mhm.
and obviously the subject of Thieves in the Night, this
Mhm.
changeling idea being represented
Mhm.
in
Where were we?
just talking about the real one-to-one correlation that you can make between
Mm.
fairy kidnappings and the alien abduction experience or phenomena.
Mhm.
um and the what people don't really understand, I think, or what ufologists have have trouble trying to come to grips with if they really are of the nuts and bolts, flesh and blood ufologist
Mhm.
variety, is that sometimes inversion equals representation, and
Right.
so if a child is given to you that's an inversion of a child, it's the exchange is what matters. It's similar. I think Patrick Harper put it the best way. He said that the fairies are always going, going, going. They always have this fairy exodus that's been talked about for
Yeah.
hundreds of years, and the aliens are always coming, 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 but never here. Fairies going, going, never gone. Aliens coming, coming, and never here. So that inversion as representation, I think, is really an important concept to wrap your
Mhm.
mind around when you're making that comparison. Um,
Well, there's loads that I want to go through with you in the book. There's just some fantastic, interesting avenues to explore. The first one for me, and I think the bit that is kind of really attractive for me from a personal perspective, because I came back to fairy lore really through kind of my own work with the Jinn and the exploration there, kind of the start of my journey. And just discovering common theme after common theme, and down to really quite specific taboos around like throwing dirty water out of the house that are almost identical, like except kind of the one declaration of warning to the Jinn is in Arabic, and the declaration of warning to the fairies was in Gaelic, but they're almost like verbatim copies of each other. And the whole thing is, and the bit that I really loved about your book is it really kind of just threw out the idea of like, well, this is just Abrahamic ideas migrating across the world. Oh, did I lose you again?
I was shaking my head because I agree with you. Yeah, yeah,
Should we turn off the video just so we got
yeah.
less
Maybe
data?
that might
Yeah.
impress or might help. Let's
Okay.
see.
Cool.
Okay, I'm gone now.
Cool. So that the idea of uh, the fact that you've taken all these kind of different points in the world where the same thing is happening with changelings really throws out the idea that we're looking at kind of just something that happens with Abrahamic faiths, that's just embedded with Abrahamic faiths. They're all from the same tree, therefore kind of the same taboos, all kind of they all have a root, as it were, through the commonalities through the Abrahamic faiths. But the work you're doing, looking at First Nations people in Australia, the Malay, and so on, really kind of throws that out.
Well, when you start looking at these from different cultures that in the consensus history of the world should not have had any contact with each other, what I like about it when you can illustrate these similarities is it really backs the traditionalists into a corner, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
because they have to admit one of three things, which none of them are comfortable admitting. Number one, the possibility is that yes, there was a global civilization
Mm-hmm.
where people exchange these ideas. But that's a very non-traditional view of the history of the world. Or they have to admit that there really is something objective and externalized about Jungian archetypes.
Yeah.
Or they have to admit that there's an objective reality to the spirit world. One of those three things has to be the case
Mm-hmm.
if you can show these different cultures having same or similar beliefs
Mm-hmm.
across geographic and temporal spans that just they shouldn't have had any contact.
Yeah. And that's just, it's tremendously exciting. It really is tremendously exciting stuff. Now, I have to actually stifle my own excitement and actually think about, well, what's going to make sense to our listeners, in the sense that some people may not be familiar with the actual idea of changeling. So I suppose kind of taking it right back to the core concept. What are changelings?
The short answer is any substitution of a child by an entity from the other world. I think that's probably the biggest umbrella that you can put it under. If you're looking at this specifically in Western folklore, and again, to dial it in a little bit closer to the British Isles, typically the fairies would take an infant, typically pre-baptism. I'm going to use the word typically a lot because there are always these outliers in these stories.
Yeah.
Typically male, typically, again, an infant, not necessarily an older child, and would exchange with them one of three things. Either it would be they would take the human child and leave behind a fairy baby, they would take the human child and leave behind an elderly fairy, man or woman, typically elderly fairy man, or they would take the child and leave behind something else, like an effigy, so to speak, a stock or a fetch, which would generally be an inanimate object cloaked in fairy glamour to appear as a child. Now, of course, you have plenty of examples of older people being taken and substituted as well, but that really wasn't part of the focus of my book. My book was
Mhm.
Thieves in the Night is basically focusing on child abduction by the
Yeah.
other world. Um, and the motives for this are really quite numerous. Typically, the one that you hear talked about a lot, which again lines up with modern ufology, is that the fairies are a dying race and that they need human stock to sort of reinvigorate their bloodline. Likewise, you'd hear stories that just like fairy food, fairy milk was a sham, and to actually get proper nutrients, they had to substitute the fairy baby
Mhm.
instead. So in this case, that'll be sort of a two for one win-win situation for the fairies. Not only do they get a human into their bloodline, but they also are nourishing one of their own in the arms of a human mother. Typically speaking, these children were voracious with their appetite. They were incredibly difficult to be around,
Mhm.
constantly making noise and being just ill-tempered and listless. Now, of course, there are some examples that are a little bit harder to find of changelings reaching adulthood. And this is without even getting into the complex question, which you really have to address, which
Yes.
is the developmental disorder side.
Yeah, and I think
Um,
you do that very well in the book as well.
yeah, it was one of those things where I almost didn't write the book because it's such a sensitive topic, and
It's
the,
very
the end,
challenging.
well, the end chapters are. I'm sure some people will push back and say that the end chapters are insensitive, and I tried to handle them as sensitively as I could. I actually spoke with a colleague of mine who has a developmentally disabled son to see if he thought anything really jumped out at him as being
Mhm.
insensitive. But it's a thought experiment, so you can take or leave. The final quote unquote conclusion. Not that it's even a conclusion. Um, but yeah, you have to address the fact that this was very much a justification for infanticide,
Yeah.
especially in amongst poor Irish farmers and whatnot.
Yeah, and like it's a different context, when you look at kind of people living in the west of Ireland, literally on the periphery of Europe, hanging on to the Atlantic coast by a very tenuous way of life that it was brutal, and this type of cultural norm was partially a result from those socioeconomic factors that people couldn't support kids that had really quite special needs, and this kind of thing manifested as a result of it. But as you again kind of outline in the book, it's not uncommon across Western Europe. It was it happened everywhere.
It did, and you see different cultures dealing with this concept in different ways. I
Mm.
was really quite astonished to find the similarities. I mean, I was aware of the similarities between the Jinn and Western fairy concepts,
Mhm.
Western European fairy concepts. And just for anybody who wants, because I've gotten in trouble for this before, and it's not at all what I mean. If I say that the Jinn are Middle Eastern fairies, I'm not implying that there is some sort of one belief system is more legitimate than others. I would feel just as comfortable saying that the fairies are European Jinn. It's just
and
just
and
just
I
just the
have and I have used that term with Islamic scholars, where we calling it like fairies are just simply Irish jinn, to which they were very receptive.
yeah, yes. So you have this. I mean, what it really boils down to is you've got this sort of rule of thumb amongst cultures worldwide that there are a race of otherworld beings, typically but not always shorter than human beings, who typically but not always live underground, who do enjoy stealing children, and to see that belief system manifest in places like Africa with this tradition of the abiku, which is this spirit that sort of takes up residence in a woman's womb and comes out because their goal is to amass earthly goods before dying and taking those earthly goods off to the other world. To see that sort of the parsimony of these two beliefs aligning is what really blew my mind. I really didn't expect to find those parallels in that part of
Mm.
the world. Um,
Yeah, and then of course you unpack that even further, and it's like an association with wealth, association with treasure, which both jinn and fairies have.
oh, absolutely. And then the way that I mean, of course, again, this subject matter is going to get quite dark, people, but gets quite dark in terms of how sort of violent and painful it is. But
Mm.
sometimes it would be common to sort of, uh, in order to exercise the abiku, they would actually make small incisions on a child in Africa and stuff in peppers and spices to cause pain to the spirit. And that, again, you find a parallel with that, with the sort of abuse that suspected changelings were put under in Western Europe, which, I mean, basically any sort of torturous method you could imagine was used to rectify the situation.
Yeah, and certainly the descriptions in the book are I mean, that they're horrifying. They're absolutely horrifying. And again, I've seen similar accounts in the Irish National Folklore Archive. Same thing with the heated spade, in particular, shovel. Used to flush out the Jinn or flush out the fairy. My own mistakes here.
Well, no, but that's not a mistake, because you can take a lot of these stories and just substitute out the proper nouns, and they really carry over quite well. I mean, there's some changeling stories that you read from Jinn lore that literally could have come from County Limerick.
It's very true. It's very true. And again, reading through the book, I kind of pulled out a couple of different veins from my own research that I think you'll enjoy. I mean, obviously you touch on iron in the book, and I'll come back to that. But it's interesting one of the things that I found puzzling was, okay, so Jinn are they're created from smokeless fire. So that's the story behind their creation. Yet fire is used as a prophylactic against fairies, preventative thing, to again exorcise them from a child, or get their child back from the changeling who's been left in their stead. And I was doing some research into ruqya, which is the a form of healing that's sanctioned in Islam to deal with sorcery, jinn, and the evil eye. And I came across an interesting passage, which I'll just dig out for you now. So this is from a book called by Abderraouf Ben Halima, who's a ruqya professional and practitioner, rather. And as weak points listed for jinn for a part of their exorcism, fire is the first one listed. It's like, we discovered that fire is a weak point for jinns. We know that they are created of fire, and we discovered that they melt in contact of fire and cannot bear it. If you approach a candle to the patient's sole of the feet so they can feel the heat without being burned, the genie suffers a lot from the heat. So it's again, you talk about the inversion. It's the reverse of what you would assume, thinking that the jinn is created from fire. So this is a tool that is used directly to unseat the jinn that has taken up residence in the patient here.
That's fascinating. If I might interject, and I'm going to sort of bounce a question back to you, because this is a little bit more of your bailiwick than it is mine. Is smokeless fire meant to represent literal smokeless fire, or is it an attempt to describe things like will-o'-the-wisp lights and things like plasma phenomena?
I think you've hit the nail on the absolute head. It's plasma phenomena from. I mean, in fact, he says in the book. He says,
okay, well, there you go.
that they're describing plasma. That's essentially what they're plasma beings.
So in that case, it's it's not really that they came from fire. They came from some sort of different element. I mean, it's I think it's I'm trying to remember the gentleman's name. Wonderful book about positing that a lot of supernatural phenomena are in fact some form of intelligent plasma. Andrew Collins, I believe it was him.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's an idea that I think should be looked at a little bit more closely, because I think there might be some merit to it.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely something to it. And I thought of you recently when I had a guest on, a chap called Wilmar Tal, who is a Dutch academic researching the Reichmann collection, which is a collection of incredible illustrations and a manuscript on the kind of history, stories, behaviors of gnomes from Holland. And
oh wow!
And one of the things he talks about are a creature called the I'm going to murder this now when I try and pronounce it.
Welcome to my world.
Yeah.
Trying to pronounce all these Gaelic words.
Oh, I mean, Christ, I'm from Ireland and I still butcher them.
Fair enough.
It's with the weefin, and it basically translates as the white wife, white
Okay.
woman, and it exhibits almost exactly the same behavior as the banshee. Not friendly. If you come across this the being, run was Wilmar's advice. But he also described it as being kind of a correlation with the white mist that appears in the forest at a certain time of year. That he reckons that's what people were referring to. This kind of white figure that people kind of would start to make shapes out of the mist when they were looking at it. So but again, it was like another kind of bingo. There it is again. The white woman.
Absolutely. It's and the interesting thing about the white mist is it really drives home to me the fact that we for so long we grow up and we're told that fairy tales, differentiating them from fairy stories, fairy tales are without any real applicable use to the actual world beyond say basic archetypal ideas of knights slaying dragons and whatnot. But once you start to realize, you start to see the recurring motif of these sort of moments that punctuate passage to the other world, like storms, like blizzards, like again fog or something like that, then you start to say, oh, there's actually something speaking to us through these stories that we have really kind of ignored as a culture in the West.
Yeah, I think you're right, and even kind of like quite directly when we look at the idea of that the fairy wind, Angiha She, like which you mentioned a few times in the book about people getting hit by the fairy wind, being taken away by the fairy wind, or it being a portent of imminent death. Again, the same motif directly within Jinn lore and wind as a form of travel for these beings. So there's a certain correlation, absolutely a correlation within the folk. There's a very, very rich vein that's related directly to weather, and also ability to control the weather.
Yeah, it's interesting. Once you sort of get that in your brain, you start to look at thunderstorms and whirlwinds a little bit differently. It really does re-enchant your world in a way. And what's interesting to me is once I really started getting into fairy lore, before I knew about that correlation between the weather and the fairies, I used to feel like the most fairy time in the forest is when, like, that moment before a storm hits and the trees are just alive and they're just you look up and the canopy is just completely moving and the wind's going through the trees, and something inside me, before I even knew about that connection, was like, this is fairy time.
I know what you mean. I mean, like, certainly kind of where my folks live in the west of Ireland is in County Mayo, and like being kind of back at home, say over Christmas, and like going out for a walk across the bogs, like you see that mist across the bog. It is a total liminal place. This is not a human. This is not a human landscape. This is not being brought under the mastery of human civilization in any shape or form. It is a wilderness. Like it's not wilderness. I mean, by the sheer nature of the size of Ireland, it's not wilderness,
Right?
In the way that kind of you'd understand that from an American point of view, but it's it's inhospitable, and it's it's dangerous.
But good Lord, does the other world push back in Ireland? I mean, as much as much of an effort has been made to make it pastoral, the other world really does. I mean, it's got a toehold, but it's a strong toehold. When I had the chance to visit there 3 years ago, I was like a kid in a candy store. I mean, just to be, because once you get an eye for what a fairy hill or a fairy mound or a fairy fort looks like, and there are different variations, but once you get an eye and once you catch on to what those look like, you're just driving down the road and you see these things. With one exception, humorous exception. I can't remember, I think we were driving from Sligo.
Yeah,
Sligo. That's what I thought. We're driving from Sligo down to Galway, and I saw these giant tall rocky mounds off the off the side of the road. I'm like, oh my God, there's one. We're going to go right there now. And my wife's like, okay, she's indulging me. So we take this road and we go up this gravel road and we get to the top, and it's actually a gravel pit
Quarry.
for paving roads. It's a quarry. So my spidey sense did not work that day. That's for sure.
Oh, that's brilliant. I love stuff like that. What was I going to say is, yeah, like, I mean, look, when I was a kid, so I grew up in Galway, and like we bought our site where we built our home off a kind of an elderly farmer in the area, and like the kind of the complete quintessential bachelor farmer, with that kind of face where I can't tell if he's 60 or 100, that kind of look. And and he spent Christmas dinner with us at one stage, and kind of started talking about the lore of the area, and where I grew up kind of overlooked Galway Bay. It was really quite a beautiful place. But again, it has that kind of level of like darkness that you don't really, I mean, you do get it in rural areas, but like for people who grow up in cities, they don't really understand what darkness means. Like, and I mean that just in absolutely the kind of like, it's devoid of light, bar starlight if you're lucky. But if it's pitch black, it is pitch black, and you can't see past the end of your nose. And like those nights, and that, in a rural landscape, and those nights, you do, you don't feel like you're the dominant species. That's just inherent in it, and kind of, with that kind of that, the primordial fear that we have of not being able to see, and kind of our main sensory provision is gone. But he was saying to us that, yeah, just behind your house, there's this fairies in the hill behind the house, and just been absolutely matter of fact. Yeah, no, I saw them, and all that kind of stuff. And it was really kind of coming back to Ireland after kind of my adventures in India, and exploring this, that it brought all these memories back of kind of my childhood and the stories that I've been told, and kind of from lots of kind of people in my life when I was a kid. And what I really started to think about was, and I had a correlation recently in listening to the kind of the Higher Side Chats podcast. There's a chap called, I think, Phoenix Aurelius, if I remember correctly, was on it.
Sounds right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he was talking about kind of like the magic is thicker in the Amazon, right? Mm-hmm. Like because of just the nature of the wilderness, and because of the nature of the people's relationship with it, and their own belief. And it struck me listening to that it was the same in Ireland, that the magic was thicker there, because it never had the Industrial Revolution, and so much of what happened to Western Europe never hit Ireland, to the point where, it was still really in its reality was within myth. That's how reality was structured. That's how it was described. It was described with myth by the peasantry, less so the kind of the Anglo-Protestant ascendancy, and that to me kind of that gave an almost framework where this is alive. This is a living thing because people believe in it, and the magic is thicker there because of the wilderness, because of the wildness of the place. I felt that was an analog. I mean, I could be clutching at straws, but it was certainly kind of that was a gut connection rather than.
No, I would completely agree with that. I mean, in my experience, again, my limited time in that part of the world, you definitely have the sense that you are a foreign object in certain places. You definitely feel like, oh, if you're staying the night in a house or something, like, you're like, oh, they're renting this space. Like, they might own the house and they might own the land legally, but they're renting this space from something else. Yeah, I did have the opportunity to go to some sites at night around Loch Gur, and yeah, it's one of the spookiest places that I've been, but not spooky in like, because I've done my share of haunted house visits, and gone to different places, and it's a different kind of. It's an older spooky, and it's not just an American saying that. Like, there's something that feels I don't want to say I don't want to say Lovecraftian, because that's a lot more malice and a lot more indifference than I think the real thing has. But it does have that, well, yeah, that sort of thickness, that sort of inky thickness about places, that heaviness that you really can't get in a lot of parts of the States, I think. I mean, certainly not in the suburbs of Atlanta.
And that's, and I think that's, it's a good way of looking at it. You know, I think looking at it in terms of the circumstances of the geography, the circumstances of the culture, the circumstances of the history, give they mean that kind of the I think the reality is more permeable in there. You know, I think that really resonated with me.
And I think that the, it's easy to sit here and bemoan the loss of that, but I do think that the younger generation, I don't think that they take it as seriously, fairy lore in Ireland. And I may be completely off base here. I don't think they take it as seriously, but I think there still is a respect there that you don't find for many supernatural things on this side of the pond. Among the younger generation.
I think that's a fair observation, and I actually think it's quite an articulate description of how people see fairy lore within Irish culture. You know, you will have kind of very modern urbanite, like sophisticated Dubliners, who at the same time will be like, kind of scoff and kind of laugh at maybe these kind of seemingly archaic rural beliefs, but at the same time probably wouldn't cut down a whitethorn.
Exactly. Yeah. Don't take any unnecessary risks. It's like instead of Pascal's wager, it's like Queen Maeve's wager or something.
yeah, exactly. And certainly you find that within the Islamic community. Like they from Islamic friends, there certainly is a hedging of one's bets. And you would often listen to devout Muslims who would say, "I don't fear the jinn because I have my faith in Allah, and Allah kind of overrules and supersedes everything." And that's definitely kind of a viewpoint. But then when you've got kind of like your kind of your less devout Muslim, you will see, you will certainly hear stories of kind of like, I get it, but please let's just not talk about that.
Exactly. Yeah, it's interesting.
Couple of conversations later, I've gotten loads of stories about, my brother was renovating this room, and he could hear the jinn next door in kind of like the place that the house they were renovating, like, those kind of stories that people will start to volunteer after you kind of explore the subject.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've read a couple of stories because, I mean, the jinn thing more than the fairy thing. I mean, Jacques Vallée talked a little bit about fairy folklore, but he never really, to my knowledge, and I know some people who know him relatively well, never really fully embraced the, like, the UFO phenomena is all fairies. He never really embraced that. But the jinn thing was very much has been very much embraced by the ufological community. I know that Rosemary Ellen Guiley was very much into, so everything is Jinn.
Yes.
Sort of like the Giorgio Tsoukalos of that. And Gordon Crichton. That's me. Look, I'm not saying it's fairies, but it's fairies. I'm sort of that guy now.
That's brilliant. That's really
But even Gordon Crichton, who was the editor-in-chief for many years of Flying Saucer Review, was very much on the Jinn bandwagon. And I've read stories, I think both from Rosemary and from some of Gordon Crichton's stuff, of secular Muslims, people who identify with that culture, but don't necessarily practice, who have jinn encounters. It happens to them too, and then they'll invoke Allah, and the phenomena will stop. And you see that mirrored in fairy folklore and in the UFO folklore too. And it doesn't really seem to be, people, oh Lord, the Christian right in America will say that this is somehow proof that all these things are demons. And I think that's a really reductive dichotomy to embrace, as opposed to,
I agree completely with you on that. And again, I was really interested to see how you broached that topic in the book, because it's something that I've thought about an awful lot, and it's certainly kind of, when I talk about fairies, and I get challenged by or talk about fairies and jinn, and I've spoken about on kind of this podcast and some of my own lectures, where you get challenged by whatever kind of Abrahamic group you're not referring to. So it's like by invoking the name of Christ, it pushed the fairies away. As you get completely, it's a theme throughout Irish folklore, but absolutely the same is true within Islam. And this really made me think about kind of, well, why is that? Why does this work? Because the presumption is that that, well, can they both be right? Are they both working at the same time? Because that doesn't work in either faith. That is completely contradictory to what the rest of the tenets of the faith, respective faiths would outline. So how can they both work? And that, clutching at straws, I'm hypothesizing that it's either the power of the individual's belief, or it's some sort of egregoric effect. Who knows?
Both those resonate with me, and I say all this as a practicing Christian. I mean, at the same time, when people ask me what my religion is, I say I'm a weirdo Christian because I've done my share of sigil work, and I think that we're not looking at a necessarily black and white spirit world. I think as Gordon White has often put it, more of a spirit ecosystem is a more accurate way of looking at this. But the circles that I travel in tend to think that yes, there's something tangible about belief and about belief in a higher power, whatever it may be, even if it's, you want to dilute it to just being the power of your own will. There's something about believing in something that somehow pushes back on that. And I don't really know what it is. I think it's less that a higher power intervenes for you and more like this is like shark repellent, something more along those lines. But again, that's completely speculative on my part. But if you're ever if you ever find yourself around something that you don't like, just pray to something, and it a lot of times the activity will sort of die down.
Well, absolutely, and when I've been contacted by people who are experiencing disturbances and not knowing what to do, I mean, I've literally recommended multi-faith options. It's like use the relevant psalms, but also check out the Islamic surahs and hadiths as well. Like, I mean, use what works, but speaking about what works, obviously the subject of iron inevitably comes up when we talk about Jinn and fairies. And I was wondering if you could talk to that a bit.
I think there's a book to be written. I don't want to write it because it sounds a bit dull, but I think there is a book to be written on the widespread prevalence of iron being used to repel all sorts of supernatural phenomena. And it is one of those things, again, that seems to be very cross-cultural. I spoke with again Gordon White about this, and he thought that perhaps it had something to do with this God-given skill to bend and to make manifest tools out of metal through the process of metallurgy. It's being almost like a God-stolen Promethean sort of skill. I like that idea. I also like that the idea is sort of like a Sidney Hartland science of fairy tales outlook, that iron is representative of man's ability to shape reality to its will. And if you take that through like an almost sort of Aleister Crowley idea of, literally picking up this cup sitting beside me is a manifestation of magic because I'm making thought into the real world. I'm using my thoughts to change the real world. Then the idea of having plows and axes and pitchforks, really they're magical. They become magical implements in and of themselves. And the fact that they are used to maim the natural world, I think that's the best explanation that I can come up with.
I like that, and certainly you see that in the lore. You've seen fairies and fairy magic become undone, literally by blacksmiths, and using their tools to reverse the damage done by fairies through their presence. And it's that imbued power within the blacksmith's tools that represents the mastery over nature and the elements.
I mean, the blacksmith was one of those individuals in these cultures, especially, again, we're talking mostly about Western Europe, but who was basically like secondary to, the priesthood in terms of being able to interface with the other world, which is really interesting because I have I have a friend who is a musical instrument repairman, and he goes from house to house, and he can't seem to get away from some really profound and disturbing spirit phenomena. And finally, I'm like, it's you, man. Like you're the one. You're basically a modern day blacksmith in some sense. Working the lathe and working with all these metals, and between that and some trauma in his past, I'm like, you stand out like a flashlight.
Yeah, could be. I have some interesting bits for you on iron that I'd like to kind of table for you.
Please.
So one was kind of a piece that a Turkish individual left on a YouTube comment, and I kind of unpacked a bit, but it was really interesting. It was a fantastic point, and he talked about iron in terms of like there is a surah, one of the chapters within the Quran that is called Al Hadith, which means the iron, and in that chapter, Allah explains that iron is not from this world; it's not from Earth, and the exact verse, English translation of it says, like, we have already sent our messengers with clear evidence and sent down with them the scripture and the balance that the people may maintain their affairs in justice, and we sent down iron, wherein is great military might and benefits the people, and so that Allah may make evident those who support him and his messengers unseen. Allah Indeed, Allah is powerful and exalted in might. So it's direct references to iron. And then it has a number of references of how iron falls to earth.
Mm-hmm.
And they talk about basically, iron is ultimately created from, from stars,
Mm-hmm.
and supernovas, etc., etc. And there's a number of verses that go through that. Um,
That's a powerful image, that you're holding something that was forged in the heart of a dying
yeah.
star. I mean, meteoric iron, I'm sure.
Well, wait, you hear this. So these are other quotes, right? And this is like and we have certainly beautified the nearest heaven with stars, and have made from them what is thrown at the devils, and be prepared for them as punishment of the blaze. O company of Jinn and mankind, if you are able to pass beyond the regions of the heavens and the earth, then pass. You will not pass by authority from Allah. So it's the idea of like the authority, the external authority in space,
Mm-hmm.
which is the kind of the home of iron, and like there will be sent to you upon a flame of fire and smoke, and you will not be able to defend yourselves. And this is what he's kind of referring to shooting stars, or meteors rather, hitting the earth, which is what the kind of loose translation from the Tibetan Bon tradition is, we call sky iron. So the iron of meteorites, and it's talking about this as protection against any rebellious devil. And again, kind of looking at that and looking at things like purbas, the magical knife within the kind of Bon and Vedic tradition, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so sky iron is the most favored, and that is the tantric use. I'm sure you know, with purba, what a purba encompasses the curing of disease, exorcism, killing demons, consecrations, and weather making. And it's just kind of like another cultural cross reference of the kind of the importance of iron. But I thought that was a really interesting view of it. There's an otherworldly element to it, and that there's this kind of analog within the Quran that references things falling to earth from the heavens that will be imbued with a power that can be used against devils.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me, because as much as I lean in the direction of, aliens are fairies,
Yeah.
um, there is some form of communication with the stars and something beyond the stars that's happening here, that I feel like a lot of people I've talked to are really close to pinning it down, but they haven't quite. It's sort of like that inversion that, when people talk to me about ancient aliens, I'm like, well, I think the main problem with the ancient alien hypothesis is that they're saying we misinterpreted extraterrestrials for gods, when actually in reality, I think now in the present, we're misinterpreting gods for extraterrestrials. So this idea that there is some sort of back and forth communication between us and this other in the heavens, as exemplified by the stars, I think that's getting closer to the actual objective truth than
Mm.
fairy lore or Jinn lore or modern ufology. And, I keep don't want to turn this into a drinking game with his name, but again, this is sort of the central thesis of Gordon White's book, Starships. Is the idea
Yeah.
that somehow the constellationally speaking, we're in some sort of dialogue with that world, and
Mm.
so the idea that a material that would give us some sort of unique magical properties would come from that dialogue. I really resonates with me in a special way.
Yeah, and it's got like, I mean, it's an analog with the Promethean myths as well. It's there. What came down from heaven. In this case, was given rather than stolen. But there's a lot there. And the other bit, which this is really, we're getting into woo woo territory. So grant me some, as if we're not already kind of in woo woo territory.
That's okay. I don't live in woo woo territory, but I definitely rent a cottage there, so we're good.
We have a visa.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I had a gentleman called Dr. Robert Alcorn on the show, I think maybe 2 years ago. And he's an author and a psychiatrist and a shamanic practitioner and healer. And he kind of just dropped into conversation through his own healing work that one of the reasons the Jinn had an issue with the human beings is that they hated the iron in our blood, that this was something that was a cause of irritation. Now I've heard the complete reverse as well, that actually blood is a form of sustenance and revitalizing force for these beings. But an interesting kind of anomaly that kind of came to my attention is that there's an actual medical condition which is kind of a anecdotally known as the Celtic curse, and it's a genetic disorder called hemiochromatosis, which is mainly seen in people of Celtic origin, and it causes them affected by it to absorb excessive amounts of iron in the blood. I didn't even know where to go with that.
What's hilarious about that, and you're gonna think that I'm making this up, but
Yeah.
I actually, in my outline for Thieves in the Night, I had a section that was going to be dedicated to that topic, and I didn't know what to do with it either, so I left it out. It's one of those things where I just didn't know how to pin that down.
Yeah.
But in terms of the aversion to human blood, I mean, that does resonate with certain bits of folklore about fairies having an aversion to red. Some people even go so far as to say that, like, the color of fire reminds them of red because the color red reminds them of blood. Now, of course, you'll find the exact opposite.
Yeah.
Red caps and stuff like that.
Yeah.
In fairy lore, that's one of the most frustrating things about it, is that oftentimes it can be quite contradictory. But I guess that's part of the tricksterish nature. Nature of it.
Yeah, it's this little kind of like a folkloric landmines that get in there to throw you off the scent. Well, it's really interesting that you're aware of that. I mean, it's just one of those things that I was just when I kind of came across this, I was like, wow, I'm amazed by that. I just no idea where you could even go with that.
Well, where we should go with that is, but there's such dismissal of supernatural topics in the mainstream. Where we should be going with that is we should be running full panels on people who are repeat observers of these things.
Yeah.
Full blood panels on them, and see if we can get some data from that. But
yeah,
it's all such a mess. There's no one-stop shop for any of these things. UFOs, Bigfoot, fairy sightings. And so you have to sort of cobble things together, and it's the as Valet remarked when he was trying to build a UFO database, garbage in, garbage out. You can't really do it.
Yeah. But I mean, you touched on that in the book around kind of the prevalence of Scots-Irish names in data sets was extraordinarily high. That it was a Whitley Schreiber. Whitley Schreiber that pointed that out.
Yeah, Whitley observed that, and again, I'm like, I guess so, if he says so.
Yeah.
But again, it's one of those things where it's so much of this stuff is anecdotal, and I think part of me can sit here and bemoan that fact, but at the same time, I think it's really baked into these phenomena to always be anecdotal. You know,
Yes.
that's why you're not going to measure this stuff in a laboratory, and you're not going to catch the leprechaun and shake it until it gives you the gold. It's just not going to happen.
No, not at all. Right. I know before we started the show, I did a quick test with some audio. So I wanted to play 2 interviews that I did. Hopefully this will work. Let me just quickly check that.
I'm excited to hear them. So excited.
Let's see if you can can you hear this.
I'll crank up.
Can you hear that?
Saw and
Yes.
in your garden with your sister.
That's right, yes.
So could you talk us through it? What happened?
Well, it was very strange, really. This is going to sound...
Sorry, I should probably give some actual run through as to what this is.
A little context. Yeah,
that would be helpful for anyone listening. So what this is an audio clip of an interview. There's a second one as well with 2 elderly ladies, Irish ladies, talking about fairies they saw when they were kids. But there's a couple of things that I think have your fairy bingo card ready. Now they don't have any kind of background in terms of the motifs, the themes. They're just recounting their experiences.
Okay, and where in Ireland?
Dublin, County Dublin.
Okay.
Odd, but you know the way people say they see fairies in the bottom of the garden, but we actually did. And we were quite young at the time. I think we might have been about 5-ish, that kind of age. And I was with my sister, and both of us happened to look down and see this little head bouncing up between the grass. And we both looked at him, and they had this big almond-shaped eyes with enormous ears, with a cap, peaked cap. And he was kind of peeking out, and then he'd pop back in again and peek back out. But he had a sort of a menacing vibe to him. You knew he wasn't a lovey-dovey kind of thing. And I looked at my sister, and she looked at me, and we both looked back as if to say to each other, "Do you see what I see?" And we did. Both of us talked about it. And then when we met up with the rest of our family, we were kind of voicing what we saw. Mm-hmm. Because they were older than us, they just dismissed it, and we thought, oh, it's not really safe to mention these things.
Yeah.
So we just didn't.
Yeah.
But we saw him again.
You saw it again, really? Wow, okay.
Well,
and you sure it was male?
No, I'm not sure. But it looked more male.
They
had the male energy.
Right, okay.
And yeah, it was very, very strange. I remember later on, when I was an older child, drawing him, mm-hmm. because I was determined not to forget it. Mm-hmm. Somehow I knew that this wasn't imagination.
Yeah.
And my sister confirmed, no, we did both see it together.
And by peaked hat, do you mean a pointed hat or like a flat cap? What kind of cap are you talking about?
It was like a skull cap went up to a point.
Right.
But it was quite tall. No hair. It was like the hat came right down over to just his lower forehead.
Yeah. And
the hat actually went behind his ears.
Right.
So it was
like a skull cap at a point.
Yeah. Basically.
And you mentioned almond eyes. Like, were they coloured eyes or
huge?
Black?
No, they weren't. They were dark eyes, but they weren't all black. It wasn't like there was definitely a white around.
Yeah.
The eye. It wasn't like a black eye. It was just. Yeah.
And what kind of colour clothes was he wearing?
I don't remember any clothes. It's just his face was the biggest thing.
Right. And you saw him twice.
Yes.
And you mentioned you got a bit of a sinister feeling of it. Like menacing or
no,
just
more like mischief.
Mischievous, right.
It's more like he was playing, as if to say, now you see me, now you don't.
Right.
But you really do see me.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
What do you think of that one?
Well, obviously she's delusional. I mean, No, I mean I mean I love it. You're right. There is a lot of things in that bingo card. I mean, you know me with my areas of interest, I automatically locked onto that almond eye description because
Yeah.
that's so alien gray.
Mhm.
But it's a nice little description of sort of almost a more Freudian fairy, which is so. So when people say that they see those Victorian little sexy ladies with wings,
Yeah.
I don't throw those out because I think that whatever this is wears different masks and it can look like whatever the hell it wants to. But when people come to me with that sort of impish, tricksterish,
Yeah.
more menacing story or vibe that they get from these sightings, that really strikes a chord and resonates with me.
Mhm.
But I mean, that's absolutely wonderful. I wish I could see the picture that she drew.
I'll show you. Hang on a second.
Oh, excellent.
Share my screen. 1 second.
Are you a genie? Because I just made a wish and you're making it come true.
Okay. Can you see that?
Oh yeah.
That's the picture. Yeah.
That is fantastic. That reminds me of there was this great story and I wish I could remember who it was. It was I talked about it in Trojan Feast. If you can bear with me for a minute, I'll find it.
Sure.
There's a great story in ufology. It was so this was Gene Hingley, January 4th, 1979, where she hears some sort of strange sound and sees a glow coming from the carport,
Mhm.
and there are these three silvery figures that look like basically like that in the face.
Yeah.
She interpreted them as aliens, but they had these fairy wings on them, and she ended up giving them water, which they drank, and sent them on their way with some mince pies that she'd made. They had they took the mince pies and floated into this large orange object that was waiting in her garden, and the ground had burn marks around it, and some of the electrical appliances in the house were ruined afterwards. And she actually made a sketch that you can find in some of those old Flying Saucer Review editions. If I can find one, I'll pass it along at some point. I don't have it at hand, but they look so much like that face that she drew. That's fantastic.
It's mad, isn't it? So I've got another one for you, and this one again, I was reading through your book, and you have that piece where you talk about chimneys, and that chimney being the connection between heaven and earth, and that kind of the liminal piece there. And it reminded me of this, and I was like, when I was kind of just reading through the book, I was like, I've got to play these for Joshua.
Yes, please.
So let me just tee this one up for you. And it's quite crappy quality, to be honest. So forgive me.
All right, I'll lean in close.
Yeah, I'll turn it up a bit so you can hear. Okay, where do we go? And there's a couple of details in here as well, which I think will resonate if you can make them out. All right, here we go.
In those days, in the old bedrooms, there was always a small fireplace. This was painted a green colour with a lid over the top. It only got lit when somebody was sick.
Okay.
I'm looking at the fireplace, and I see this face coming out of the fireplace. The same face, the same dark hair, bright eyes, and pointy. When the thing that struck me most was his ears were pointy.
And were they largers or like?
Oh no, they were the same as you and I, but they were just like into a point at the top.
Right. And what kind of feeling did the I mean, what would you describe? What would you say it is?
Well, no fear. I just kind of looked and I smiled, and he smiled back.
Right.
It wasn't. I didn't consider it wasn't aggressive. I was quite young, so I didn't even consider anyone could be aggressive.
Right.
But he wasn't. No, he just smiled, and You know, the other time was I was in an orchard that my granny owned.
Here we go.
And we all went in time to get a few goods, we stuff like that. And I heard Granny moving. So I hid beside a tree. Now, this tree was only a sapling. It was not a big tree. I'm standing there going, I hope Granny doesn't see me. And I look up, and there's the same. He's the same smiley face, the same pointy ears. It is exactly the same.
Wow.
And this taken over a period of years. I said, I actually did a painting of him, of me looking.
I'll leave it there. I don't know if you could make that out at all. Now I don't have the painting that she's referring to, but the audio is quite poor. So my apologies in that regard. But what she said was, I used to go down to my granny's garden to pick gooseberries and blackberries, and again, when I was reading through the book and you talk about this, I was like, there you go, there it is again.
Yeah, it's interesting. Someone just asked me the other day about why berry bushes are like this sort of focal point for a lot of these different phenomena. If anybody's listening, there are plenty of Bigfoot encounters that happen around berry bushes, and a lot of warnings in a lot of different cultures against going to berry bushes. And I don't know, it's one of those things, like berry bushes are kind of a focal point for everything. You know, in hunter-gatherer societies, there would have been important places to visit, specific places to visit, just as rivers would be. And, you know, there are plenty of sightings of these phenomena around water as well. So you got to ask your question, you know, is it because these things are attracted to these spaces, or is it because these are just places where both phenomena tend to go?
Right.
But, you know, if, again, with the idea that something in our, you know, normal reality could make an impression upon the spirit world, perhaps, it seems to reason that there is almost like there's some sort of spiritual power in calorie counts. You know, I'm not sure that's completely spurious for me to make that connection, but it is interesting. I love the fact that she saw the same face separated by time and space. How long did she say it was between the two sightings?
She said it was like a couple of years. So kind of in kind of the other conversations, it was like when she was like 4, and then again when she was like 5. And again, it just struck me with how you describe the cases in the book, and how you've pictured this, the commonalities that people have. I mean, the only thing really kind of different is that they're girls rather than boys in kind of in some of the commonalities that you described in the book.
Yeah, but if you look at you know, the tradition of fairy doctors, a lot of those tended to be female.
Right. Okay.
So it's, you know, you've got fairy abduction of children tending to be male, but then as you know, people get older, a lot of these older changelings tend to be female. You know, if you're looking at it from a purely, you know, psychosocial standpoint, you're like, well, these are marginalized classes, children and, you know, women and children. So of course they're the ones who are going to get all the blame for being, you know, labeled changelings if they deviate from standard behavior. But again, going back to the thing of her seeing the same face twice, I really like that, because it, to me, underscores how personal these phenomena are.
Right. Okay.
And it, you know, sort of makes you think about, you know, if did she see two different things that knew that was like, and that was like her preferred fairy face that she projected onto them, or, you know, or is this literally the same, you know, spirit that follows her around? I mean, going back to my story of my friend who's a musician, instrument repairman, and him going to different houses, you know, houses that don't have any activity, and then he goes there and they suddenly do have activity. I think there's something about some people not only being more open to this, but certain things and perhaps even entities being sort of tethered to them. You know, if you're going to take sort of a negative, you know, Holy Roman Catholic Church stance, you'd say that these people are being demon ridden. I don't think that's necessarily it. I think that just sometimes, you know, if time and space are much more accessible and closely related, but for something in the other world, then it makes perfect sense that she might see the same thing twice. And then there's the chimney thing. You know, it's funny. You grow up believing in Santa Claus, and then somebody says Santa Claus isn't real, and then you start to look at the fact that, you know, chimneys are sort of in worldwide folklore, you know, given the special attribute of being sort of a gateway between, you know, the heavens and the earth. And then there are stories of people who claim to have, you know, seen Santa Claus, and you know, the first knee-jerk reaction is to write that off. But again, if we're dealing with something that traffics in cultural perceptions and wears different masks, it really puts those stories in a different light. And the fact that, you know, Santa Claus comes down the chimney. I'm not necessarily saying I believe in Santa Claus, but I think that's I mean, a Santa egregore, kind of like you were talking about earlier. Yeah. I do think that that these things are culture dependent. They tend to adapt with the culture and change.
Yeah, no, I think that's bang on the mark. So I suppose my next question really for you is, you know, what's next? What's your next project that's coming up?
I have a couple of things. I'm actually a little bit manic right now because I have some stuff in my personal life that's sort of taking up a lot of my time, and I've got a couple of different things that I'm trying to get off the ground. So the first thing that should be happening by the end of the year is volume 2 of Where the Footprints End. It's hard to believe that it took 200,000 words to get to the bottom of the weird Bigfoot thing, but when you put both volumes together, it's gonna. Yeah, Tim and I wanted to write one book, and we just had to find a way to, you know, pull a King Solomon and try to split it down the middle. So volume 1 was more folklore based. Volume 2 is evidence based. That's a bit of a misnomer because there's plenty of folklore in volume 2 and plenty of evidence in volume 1. But volume 2 deals with things like the mimicry and these anomalous footprints and some of the odder stuff. It gets into a little bit of, you know, Bigfoot and altered states of consciousness and Bigfoot and the George P. Hansen trickster model of understanding the paranormal. So really excited about it. I think volume 2 might be more offensive to the cryptozoological community than volume 1. So so that's the first thing. The second thing is I'm rounding the corner on a collection of essays that I am the editor of, detailing fairies on film.
Oh, wow.
And some of them are literally about films that are about fairies, and some of them are about viewing other films through the fairy lens. So one of my contributors is writing about Dune. One of my contributors is writing about Japanese horror. One of my contributors is writing about, I'm writing about this film from, I think it was 2012 or something. I can't remember. It's been so long since I've looked at my Word document. Borgman, which is a film that doesn't make much sense unless you view it strictly through a fairy lens. So we're fleshing that out. It also includes excerpts from a previously unpublished Brian Froud interview that I'm very excited to share.
Cool.
And then I finally settled on the topic for my next solo venture because as much as I have enjoyed working with Timothy and working with essayists, I kind of want to get back to something that's completed on my schedule. It's very germinal right now, and if anyone has any good suggestions of literature, I welcome them. Please contact me at my website, joshuacutchin.com, JOSHUACUTCHIN.com. It's a subject that I've kind of avoided for a while because there's a lot of goofy nonsense out there about it, but I really want to compile it. Is looking at alien abductions and the dead. And that's sort of the starting point. It's really going to talk about all sorts of paranormal phenomena in the dead. I think that if you look at this the right way, a lot of what we're dealing with the paranormal is like one giant ghost story with some psychopomps thrown in, you know, and the spirit world thrown in. So that's sort of the working idea. But if anybody has any good literature that's not too wacky on the UFO experience and the afterlife, please send recommendations my way. I know that there's some directions I'm going to, and for the first time, I'm actually going to be doing some archival work, I believe, at Rice University, and just little ways down the road at the University of West Georgia, which has all of Kenneth Ring's Omega Project archives.
Cool.
So yeah, please. So I'm wanting to work on that, but I've got 2 other things in the pipeline that I need to finish up first.
Well, we'll definitely leave the link to your site in the show notes. So if anyone wants to reach out to you, they can. Well, I just want to take a moment as well, just again to just commend you on the Thieves in the Night. I was just so impressed with it. I really enjoyed it. So yeah, there was a number of kind of fist punching the air moments. You know, that's exactly it.
Well, that's coming from you. That's actually quite high praise indeed. That means
thank you.
A lot to me, and it's been so nice to talk with someone who is conversant in fairy lore to the degree that we can sort of get down to a little bit more of a granular level than having to bring people up to speed and get them past the Tinkerbell idea.
And likewise, I mean, I just having the work that you've been able to pull these threads together in a in a global basis and purposely look at continents and cultures that are non-Abrahamic to just prove that model doesn't work, that it's not just a substrata of the Abrahamic faith and the Abrahamic cultures, was just really it was really punchy. I was yeah.
Well, when you have the oldest extant culture in the world, the Australian Aborigines, talking about things that sound like they're right out of Western European fairy lore, that implies a lot of things that do not fall into our current understanding of the way that the world works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And so, just in terms of the best place for people to find you, your website, or are you on the Twitters or the Facebook, or have you maintained a healthy distance?
Well, I was on UFO Twitter for a long time, but if Twitter is the cesspool, then UFO Twitter is like the accumulated sediment at the bottom of the cesspool. There's some real strident personalities on there that aren't open to new ideas. So I left Twitter back at the start of the year, and my mental health improved overnight. I do have a Facebook page. Exactly. I do have a Facebook page. The one-stop shop, though, to really stay up to date on both my interviews and my publications and conference appearances and whatnot is joshuacutchin.com. JOSHUACUTCHIN.com. There's a contact form there, and if you want to just send it to me directly and skip the middleman, so to speak, my email address for my Fortean writings is foodtaboo, FOODTABOO @gmail.com. That's a holdover from when I was writing my book on food and the paranormal. And if anybody wants to reach out to me, I'm still at the point where I can still answer every email. It may take a couple of weeks, but I can still answer every email. That might change soon, but I'm still answering everybody's correspondences right now.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to stop recording now, but hang on for a second because I want to tell you a couple of things.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Joshua. I really appreciate your time.
It was an absolute pleasure.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that. It was an absolute pleasure to have Joshua on. No doubt he'll be back on again. We had a great time recording, so I think that'll be one to watch. Certainly he'll be back on to talk about his new book with Timothy Renner that's coming out with part 2 of Where the Footprints End. So that'll be cool. Look out for that one and take care. Talk soon.